Okay. So I just wanted to introduce myself to everyone. I am Lakin Wilson. I am the Senior Special Education Advocate here at CPARC. We have developed this ongoing series. We started it about August, I think was our first one, where we kind of branded it as Advocacy Talks. So for Autism Awareness Month, we decided to reach out to Dr. Bruey to do a 3-part series, because what would be more appropriate than talking about autism in the month of April. So this is going to be our first session, which is cognitive behavior interventions with children on the autism spectrum. And then we have 2 sessions to follow, one on the 15th, that's teaching coping skills for individuals on the autism spectrum. And then on the 22nd will be our last and final session of surviving puberty with teens on the autism spectrum. So if you guys aren't signed up for them, I know a lot of you are, please feel free to reach out to our outreach coordinator, Lisette Johnson. She's the one that does all the registering for that. So in regards to we had announced that we will be giving a drawing at the end for a gift card. In order to be eligible for that drawing, you have to attend the whole presentation. And then also, if you guys have any names, I saw a couple initials, or sometimes parents are using their child's device and it might be a different name. If you could change your name or just even chat it to me in the chat box, so I'm aware, so I have the correct name, so I can mark it down so you are eligible for that drawing. If you do attend all 3 sessions, you can be added to a drawing for a bigger Amazon gift card. So got that cleared up. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Bruey. So Carolyn Bruey is a licensed psychologist, certified school psychologist, and board certified behavior analysis with more than 35 years of experience working with children and adults with autism spectrum disorders, their families and providers and agencies. She has published multiple chapters and books relevant to diagnosing and supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorders. After over 25 years of providing psychological services within her private practice, she joined the Lancaster Lebanon Intermediate Unit 13 in 2005. She is currently the program supervisor of Autism Solutions, which is a family-focused service provider that provides a variety of psychological services specific to autism spectrum disorders. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bruey.
Thanks, Lakin. With this gift card, am I eligible? I mean, I'm going to be here the whole time.
If you attend all 3.
I promise to attend all 3. I'm a little insulted. I thought everybody signing up, it was for me, but clearly it's the gift card. So there you go. Yeah, hi everybody. I was saying earlier when we were just shooting the breeze that I did come out and do some workshops for CPARC a few years back, a couple of years worth of 3 Thursdays in a row, similar to this one, and just had such a great time. And all the parents were so engaging and so involved and so dedicated to their kids. It was just rejuvenating. So I'm really glad to be back. At the same time, I'm really disappointed that it's via Zoom, because certainly it's going to dampen our ability to interact. But I am going to leave some time, like I said at the end. We'll make sure we have some time to do questions and answers. And other than that, I think I'll get going. So tonight we're going to be talking about cognitive behavior interventions with children on the autism spectrum. And you probably have heard about cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. This is just sort of it's linked to CBT in the sense that it's lots of cool strategies that you'll be able to implement with your own kids. But I didn't call it therapy in the sense that obviously you're not providing therapy, but these are terrific strategies. So let's look at the goals for tonight. Okay. There we go. We're going to review the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder, and you know what the characteristics are, but the main reason I do that is because then I'm going to use that as a springboard to talk about how the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder can influence the way kids think, in which case leads us to interventions that make the most sense. I'm going to review cognitive behavioral axioms and interventions, and I'm also going to talk about how various CBT interventions can be applied to children on the spectrum. So just briefly, let me remind you, not that you don't live it every day, background in terms of autism spectrum disorder. And I have the autism awareness on there specific to April, which is terrific. So the historical background, as I said earlier, I've been doing this for a long time. I got my doctorate in 1982, and my dissertation was specializing on teaching parents of kids on the spectrum how to best teach their children. So back then, I mean, people had hardly heard about autism. The phrase was, or the term was first coined by a man named Leo Kanner at Johns Hopkins back in the 40s. And he's the first one that sort of said, hey, there's this cluster of kids that have some certain similar characteristics. So having been in the field for so many years at this point, I've seen a lot of things come and go in terms of theory about cause. For instance, in 1982, May of 1982, when I graduated from graduate school, specializing in autism, literally that month, there was a headline in the New York Times that said, "Cure to autism found." And that what they were saying was that they had given kids some amphetamines, some medications, group of 6 kids. And of course, they became more focused and they were able to interact more more effectively, et cetera. But obviously it wasn't the cure to autism. So I've seen everything from dolphin therapy to facilitated communication, where you hold the kid's hand and they type things out. And 90% of the stuff has gone and the research hasn't supported it. But the 2 main types of interventions, or general genres of intervention, that have keep showing support in the literature and the research literature, are applied behavior analysis and within that cognitive behavior therapy. So that's why I was really happy when Lakin said, when I gave her the list of all the presentations I do, she wanted to do this one. So I think you're going to enjoy it. As far as general information, you all know this is about a 4-to-1 ratio of males to females, although that's getting a little bit closer because girls sometimes get lost just because they tend to be more social and more communicative. Myths, you've heard them, I'm sure, in terms of when I first started this, they thought parents caused autism. Moms always got the brunt of the situation, and saying they were refrigerator mothers, saying they were cold mothers, and therefore the kids were repelled and showed autistic-like features. Thank God that myth went away. The myth of vaccines in this day and age, boy, please let me tell you that there's no research to back up that vaccines cause autism. In fact, the main scientist that was pushing that a couple of probably 20 years ago at this point has lost his license as a medical practitioner just because it was not based in reality. And the etiological theories at this point are primarily that certainly there's a genetic underpinning. If you have one child with autism, the chances of having another one is more. When you look at family history, you tend to see a trend in terms of autism. And also, if you have twins, if there's twins that are identical twins and one has autism, then the chance of the second one having autism is higher than fraternal twins, where the genes aren't exactly the same as they are in fraternal or identical twins. Otherwise, etiological factors, they're still working on it. There are lots of research studies going on, trying to figure out other kinds of causal factors, but the jury's sort of out still on that one. So there's when you look at the diagnostic criteria, until May of 2013, actually, let me put it this way, from 1994 to May of 2013 was the DSM-4, which was the big manual that they use, the American Psychiatric Association puts out, that has all the diagnostic criteria for any given developmental disorder or mental health disorder. So during that time, there were 3 subcategories. There was autism, Asperger's disorder, Rett's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, and the last one was pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So some of you that have older kids might have gotten a diagnosis of, say, Asperger's disorder or PDNOS rather than autism per se. But you'll see when I get to the current diagnostic criteria that they've sort of condensed all that. And I'll tell you about that in a second. But the main reason that they did that was that, for instance, high functioning autism and Asperger's disorder and PDNOS look very similar. So I would have somebody come to my private practice and I tell the family, yes, your child has high functioning autism. Then they go to Hershey and they'd say, oh, your child has Asperger's. Then they go to Kennedy Krieger, who would say, oh no, your child has PDNOS, which would be incredibly confusing for the parents. And the only reason you ever label a child is to come up with treatment and interventions. The treatment and interventions for high functioning autism, Asperger's, and PDNOS is exactly the same. So the American Psychiatric Association decided, and frankly, I agree with it, is stop spending time teasing out these three especially, and just say, now we have a overall framework called autism spectrum disorders, which you'll see in the DSM-5 that came out in 2013. Rett's disorder was interesting, mostly in girls, hardly ever in boys. And they were actually able to identify the genetic abnormality underlying Rett's. And the way they did is they engineered the same genetic abnormality in mice, and the mice became very socially withdrawn. And one thing you need to know about Rett's is that one of the main consistent behavioral characteristics is they rub their hands together as much as possible all day. And these mice, if you pick them up by the tails, they'd rub their little front paws together. So it was a pretty good conclusive identification of the genetic abnormality under Rett's. So Rett's got into another category. And childhood disintegrative disorder was basically just autism with a later age of onset. Most of the time, autism was age 3 or younger, you had to see signs. Whereas childhood disintegrative disorder was, you saw the signs maybe at 4, 5, 6 when they started coming up. So let me go to the current one, the diagnostic criteria. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because we want to jump right into the CBT interventions. But this is what's current. And as I said, this is since 2013. Oops, we have to move some faces there so you can see it a little bit better. All right. The primary behavioral characteristics are the qualitative impairments in social communication and the presence of ritualistic repetitive activities and or interests. So I'm going to look at each one of those in general for you, give you some details. Notice it says you must meet A, B, C, and D. So all 4 of those domains have to be present in order for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. The first one is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across contexts, not accounted for by general developmental delays, and it's manifested by all 3 of those next coming bullets, 1, 2, 3 bullets. So basically, a lot of jargon there. What they're saying there is social communication, and most of the times when we communicate, there's a social component there, so they put those together. And it's not accounted for a general developmental delay. And what they mean by that is basically ID, intellectual disability disorder, that if a child only has intellectual disability disorder, of course you can have autism as well, but if it's only intellectual disability disorder, then it rules out the autism. So let's look at these a little bit in details. Remember, you have to have all 3 of the following bullets. The first one is deficits in social emotional reciprocity. And I should tell you that how these bullets work is that the italicized and bolded part, the very beginning, is the term that's used. And then the following part of the bullet is describing the range of what that might look like. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity might range from abnormal social approach. For instance, child might back into you for a hug or might come right up to you and say, you know, did you know that the roller coasters in the United States are, you know, they just start talking to some stranger about whatever their passion is. And failure of normal back and forth conversation. A lot of kids with autism have a lot of difficulty with that, understanding reciprocal conversations. They might not be able to talk about their shared interests or emotions and their affect, meaning expressing their feelings, et cetera, and understanding other people's feelings. And then to a total lack of initiation of social interaction. Again, I've been doing this almost 40 years. So I've worked with some kids that are very, very adept, you know, comparably speaking, with social interactions. And I've worked with other kids that I had a mom tell me one time to say, like, if my husband and I moved out of the house and somebody else moved in and gave this kid his iPad, he wouldn't even notice we're gone. So there's a huge, huge range in that. So that's the first one. Second one is then deficits in nonverbal communication, communicative behaviors used for social interaction. So these are, you think about communication, depending upon the research, 85 to 90% of our communication is nonverbal rather than speech or signs or whatever. It's purely that, facial expressions, body movements, hand movements, things like that. I'm blind as a bat without my contacts, so I kid around that I become deaf when I take my contacts out because I can't follow a conversation because I can't see the body language. So here's some examples, range from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication, meaning that a child might be able to gesture or talk, but not necessarily do it together in a coordinated fashion. Obviously, eye contact has been a biggie from day one. In fact, there's some really cool research, if you really want to look at possible cause effect, that looks at eye gaze of real little ones. There's a guy by the name of Ami Klin, A-M-I-K-L-I-N, who does a lot of work on looking at kids' eye gaze to see if even at a 10-month-old, 12-month-old, watching where those kids look. Do they look at the eyes and the mouth, or do they just look more scattered? And it can predict which kids end up being on the spectrum. Deficits in understanding other people's nonverbal gestures. They did some research for little 12-month-old kids, their 1-year birthday, where they showed videotapes, and then they followed those kids to say which ones ended up on the spectrum, which ones did not. And the kids at 12 months that did end up on the spectrum showed a couple of really pretty consistent characteristics. And one of them was they didn't point. And when you're around little kids, they're going around going, what's that, what's that, what's that? Like they're constantly pointing. And they didn't necessarily follow other people's points. If you said, look at that, did they look over and look back at you? So that's, pointing is such a basic gesture that some kids with autism don't demonstrate. And the total lack of facial expression or gesture. Some kids on the autism spectrum just have a very flat facial expression and not much of a range of expressing their feelings through their facial expressions or understanding your facial expressions. And then the third one, and remember you have to have all three of these. Third one is deficits in developing and maintaining relationships appropriate to developmental level. Real little ones don't, have really strong friendships. So, but by the time a kid's 6 or 7, 8 years old, you expect some friendships to develop. And that can range from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit different social contexts. So some kids with autism will learn a social behavior, but then when you put them in a situation where, it's probably not appropriate to do that social behavior, they don't know to change their behavior because the context has changed. Imaginative play in playing with other kids. As I'm sure a lot of you have your kids are not particularly good at playing imaginative or pretend play. They might play very rotely, lining things up, categorizing things over and over again. Or even if they play a game that on the surface looks like it's pretend play, when you sit back, you watch, oh my gosh, it's always the exact same scenario. They're not being particularly creative in their pretend play. To the full range of not even being interested in other kids. So those are the first, that's the first area of social communication. Second one is the presence of restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And you have to have at least 2 of the 4 bullets. So you don't have to have all of them. You have to have 2 of the 4. And the first one is stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements, or use of objects. So this is the kids where they might have repetitive use of objects. They might be spinning objects all the time, or they might be, like I said, lining things up, things like that. As far as speech, they might have echolalia, which is where they parrot back what they just heard. You might have idiosyncratic phrases where a child comes up with sort of odd choices of words and uses them and expects other people to be able to understand what they're saying. The next one is excessive adherence to routines, ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, or excessive resistance to change. So, a lot of your kids probably do this where, boy, you change one little thing in the daily schedule, or you move the couch in the living room, or, something, even at school, all of a sudden it's an assembly instead of reading, and the kids, but wait a minute, reading's always after math. What's this assembly stuff? Or you have a snow day and all the other kids are excited they have a snow day, and the kid with autism is like, but it's 8 o'clock, where's the bus? They need that predictability. You might have kids that only eat the same foods all the time. A lot of times parents will say, or professionals will assume that it's sensory motivated. And sometimes it sort of seems like it's an overreaction to certain textures of certain foods. At the same time, one time I was talking to this 14-year-old girl on the spectrum who was very verbal and able to express herself. And I said, why do you only eat these 5 things? And she said, I don't want to be startled. And what it turned out to be was, it wasn't the texture, it's just she wants life to be as predictable as possible. And if she only eats the same 5 things, she's always going to know what it tastes like. She said, you know, I could eat something new and I might even like it, but I'm startled and I don't like to be startled. All right, so remember, you only have to have 2 of these 4. Next one is highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. So, you know, when you're working with these kids or living with these kids, they get this passion in their mind, whether it's trains or numbers or roller coasters or SpongeBob or whatever it is. And that's all they want to talk about. And that's all they want to watch. And that's all they want to, you know, take with them as far as objects and items with them. And then the last one is hyper or hypo, which basically is mean an overreaction or an underreaction to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So you might have kids that have high pain tolerance. They don't take in sensory input very well. I've worked with a girl years and years ago that had was so self-injurious. We used to kid her in a dark moment, kid around that we could put her in a full body cast and she would bite her tongue. She would hit herself. She would chin rub down to the bone. She would kick her shin down to the bone, etc. So, and you would think, oh my gosh, this must be painful. Didn't seem to be painful. Within here also is the sensory stim behaviors, rubbing things, licking things, smelling things, that kind of stuff in a repetitive manner. The one thing I would like to say about this particular bullet is, of all the bullets we've read so far, this is the one that's gotten the most play lately. You know, like I said earlier, I've been through this a long time and doing this a long time. And people go through different phases of what makes them think a child might be on the autism spectrum. This one, for whatever reason, has gotten a lot of PR lately. And so I've had parents come to me and say, I think my child has autism because they don't like the tags in their clothes or the seams on their socks. I'm like, there aren't companies that makes tagless clothes because it's so common, you know. This is the one bullet. And again, you don't have to have it. So I just want to give you the message of, don't overemphasize the fact that hypersensitivity or undersensitivity to certain sensory inputs is a be all end all of autism. It's not. It's seen a lot, and I'm sure you're living with it with your kids, but it's not, it's only one bullet. All righty, next one, symptoms must be present early childhood. Remember, I said earlier in the DSM-4, that earlier one until 2013, you had to see the signs in age 3 or younger. They've broadened that to say, okay, it just has to be sort of early childhood, which is probably like age 6 and younger. And then you have to have the symptoms together, limit and impair everyday functioning. So that's diagnostic criteria. Again, I know none of you are going to be doing diagnostic evals. I just want you to have an idea of, which behaviors led to my child being diagnosed with autism, because now we're going to apply that to cognitive behavior therapy. Before we do that, though, I forgot just a couple things that couple of slides here as far as some pretty common features, distractibility. If there's another diagnosis that's on the table when I'm seeing a child to decide if they have autism, it's ADHD, because kids with ADHD, their social interactions are impacted because they're impulsive and they have no personal space and they're sort of in your face. Their communication is going to be impacted because they're probably you know, just doing a motor mouth and saying whatever's on their mind. And they might even have some repetitive ritualistic behaviors because they've got all this energy. I tested a kid earlier today. Boy, I am exhausted. You're lucky I'm talking in full sentences because this kid had ADHD and I'm getting too old for this. He was all over the place. You also see mood lability, mechanical skills, rote memory skills, sometimes some intellectual disability, self-injurious behaviors, that insistence on sameness we talked about, limited food preferences, and sleep disturbance. Now, these aren't necessary for the diagnosis, but they're just some pretty common characteristics that we see. Just a few more. Lack of danger, safety concerns, mental health concerns. Usually it's depression and anxiety that you might see in addition to autism. And in fact, the most recent research I've read says about a third of people on the autism spectrum also have a mental health disorder, and it's usually either anxiety or depression. And sometimes you see some seizures. But again, these are just sort of supplemental behaviors that you might not see. They're not necessary, or that you might see. They're not necessary for the diagnosis. All right, bounced. Okay, we got that covered. I just want to make sure that you have that underpinning as our foundation. So let's talk about cognitive behavioral interventions. It's based on at least 4 decades worth of research. It's been tweaked many, many times over all these years. But as I said earlier, ABA and CBT are the 2 interventions that have over and over again shown reliable results. And there's just some examples of other sort of precursors to cognitive behavior therapy. And by the way, I did send these PowerPoints to Lakin so she can distribute it to everybody that signed up. So you'll have these at your leisure. I meant to say that in the beginning. I hope nobody's been furiously trying to write notes. They're the most repeatedly supported therapeutic intervention. There you go. They've been applied to a wide variety of populations, from or environments, from schools to clinics, etc. Lots of different kinds of populations as well. Okay. And these are some of the populations that cognitive behavior interventions have shown to be effective with: adults, children, families, mood disorders, anxiety, anger management issues, truancy, ADHD, substance abuse, risky sexual behaviors, OCD, depression, and voila, autism spectrum disorder. Let me say this too. If any of you out there have your own individual therapy, which certainly is common with a lot of folks, I would personally make sure that your therapist has some CBT training, because almost regardless of what you're walking into, as far as what your presenting problem is that you need therapy, CBT is probably going to be a help. So it should be at least a little part of your therapy. So some of the core beliefs of cognitive behavior therapy. One is that behaviors are learned. You've heard that from ABA, right? From all your experiences with ABA. But they also say, what cognitions are learned too. Your thoughts are learned. And you didn't come out of the womb with those core beliefs and values and expectations and thought processes that you experience now. You didn't come out of the womb with them. You learned them over the years by your experiences in childhood influenced them. So the basic axiom is thoughts are internal behaviors. And just as we do with ABA, where we modify behaviors, you can modify your thoughts as well. For instance, one of my earliest memories is, I must have been like 5 or 6 at the most. I had a sandwich and my mother said, eat your sandwich, you gotta eat your sandwich. So I ate half of it. I didn't want the other half. So I hid the second half behind the cereal box that was on the kitchen table that I was sitting at. No fool here. So of course my mother found the second half of the sandwich. And I remember very clearly her talking to me about how important honesty was, and lying will always get you in more trouble than, being honest about things. And I mean, I'm 64 years old and I still believe like honesty. If somebody tells me a lie or anything like that, I am, ready to get aggravated, because that axiom that she instilled in me is still very strong. And we all have them. Some other basic axioms of CBT. Thoughts, that's supposed to be CBT, sorry about that. Cognitive behavior therapy. My initials are CTB, so I guess I was being a little bit self-focused when I made that slide. Other things to keep in mind. Thoughts and belief systems develop over time through our childhood experiences, as I just talked about. They're molded by the beliefs, values, etc., that we hear from important people in our lives. And it might be that your beliefs and expectations might not be that adaptive, So it's not always positive stuff like honesty is the best policy. You might hear it from parents, peers, teachers, etc. And your cognitions are shaped by the response that we get when we voice them to others. So, if I would express to my mom, oh, I want to tell the truth, honesty is important, she'd go, good for you, honey. So that you get that feedback from the world, which only entrenches those axioms and thought processes and values, etc., back into your into your belief system. And obviously some trauma can experience or will influence what cognitions tend to be playing a broken record in your head. So the research shows us that the combination of behavioral strategies plus cognitive interventions get the best results. As Lakin said in the beginning, I'm a board certified behavior analyst, a BCBA, as well as a licensed psychologist. So it's a really nice mesh that way. I'm a big believer in ABA, as I said earlier. And so, but what's nice is you can do them both. And the most effective way to help our kids is to do both. If you only talk to kids, especially the younger kids, about the rationales, oh, you shouldn't think that, you should think this instead. It's not like our kids are going to go, now I understand after you've said it 365 times that it's not nice to hit your sister because it hurts her, right? It's, you need the behavioral stuff, the looking at what are the consequences, good and bad, when the child shows positive behaviors or negative behaviors. So the blending of the two is your best bet. Why is that? Behavioral strategies, while they're effective, are externally driven and therefore may not be maintained once these external contingencies are no longer present. Let me put that in real, a little bit clearer terms. What I'm saying there is that, for instance, if the child's in a classroom setting and the child is earning points for appropriate behaviors, and lo and behold, the kid's getting 80%, 90%, 100% of the points every day, they're earning their rewards, life is good, showing some good behaviors. But then now it's summertime, the point system isn't in place and the kid's behavior might go down. And that shows that the child hadn't learned to think more adaptively about situations, which in turn would help them respond more adaptively to those situations. They were solely doing well, showing good behavior in order to get the rewards. Whereas, getting the consequences, as I said earlier, but also teaching kids to think differently, you're going to be much more effective because then you're getting internal and external influences on the child's progress. So let's just do a little moment here so you can start to see what I'm thinking. What are your first thoughts when you hear your mother call you by your full name? When you were growing up and your mother would say, Melissa, Sarah, or my name was Carolyn Ann, I knew I was in trouble. Your first thoughts when you hear your father whistling a happy tune might be, oh, life is good, he's in a good mood. What's your first thought when the phone rings in the middle of the night? Probably, oh my gosh, what's wrong? Something must be wrong. Somebody's in an accident, somebody's sick, whatever. What's your first thought when somebody taps your shoulder when you thought you're alone in the house? Boom, you're anxious, right? There's nothing inherent about somebody touching you on the shoulder to make you anxious. It's your thoughts about that situation which makes you anxious. So those past experiences leads to current thoughts, beliefs, expectations. Some advantages of cognitive behavioral interventions. They're really easy to learn. You're going to end tonight with some ideas on what you can do with your kids, which is exactly as it should be. They're brief, they're time limited. Like I said, I've been in this field so long. When I first started, Freudian therapy was still in place, where you would go to see your therapist multiple times a week, and it could be for weeks or years that you go to that person. CBT is time limited, very goal oriented, clear discharge criteria to help an individual get to the point where they're able to be on their own without the therapeutic supports. It's very problem solving focused. It's very here and now focused too. So we're saying, okay, what is the problem right now? How are we going to focus on that problem right now and make it better? Rather than, oh, tell me about your early childhood, or tell me about, things that happened long ago. It's here and now. It's optimistic because you can control the problem. You can control the way you think, as hard as it is. And when we get into the specific interventions, we'll talk about the fact that it's by purely telling somebody more adaptive ways of thinking, it's not going to lead to immediate change. I always make the analogy that it's like learning another language. I used to be bilingual in Spanish. It's been many years since that was true, but there was a time where I was thinking in Spanish, dreaming in Spanish, etc. And I would remember very clearly that I went from when I first started learning Spanish, that I would hear somebody talk in Spanish, I would translate it in my head, and then I would speak in Spanish back. But it would have to be like this little in between transition moment in my head to make that transition or that translation. I remember very clearly in middle school or high school, a day where all of a sudden I was thinking in Spanish, and that made me be able to be way more fluent in my Spanish. It's the same with learning new ways to think. So instead of thinking, catastrophic thoughts, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing that ever happened, but everyone will hate me, whatever, those kind of thoughts, you say, oh, it's okay, I just made a mistake, all these rational thoughts. But what'll happen initially is, oh my gosh, that this is catastrophic, this is going to be the horrible things, this is the worst thing that ever happened. Oh no, wait a minute. You talk to yourself, you have this little cognitive debate. And then there'll come a time with our kids where the automatic thoughts are the rational ones. But count on there being a transition there, because it's a tough, as I said, they're automatic thoughts. The negative ones, the irrational ones are automatic. So you're feeling a certain feeling without even thinking for a moment about what thoughts led you to have those feelings. Okay, let's move on. Some more advantages. The child's actively involved. When I sit down with kids, and when I show you some of these slides that I use with kids and some of the interventions that I use with them, they're actively involved with them. Now, obviously you need a child on the spectrum that's relatively adept. This is going to be a little harder, certainly with kids that are nonverbal or less adept. But at the same time, with the kids that are even to some extent verbal, I've worked with kids that are able to catch on to this. They might do some homework assignments. I'll have kids write down, what were your thoughts when you were feeling in that situation where you're upset. It is a quantifiable measure of progress, because you can take data and parents can take data in terms of how often the child's showing those adaptive thoughts. You can teach children how to think more rationally rather than what to think. So the more you can teach a kid to recognize certain thought patterns, and we're going to go through them in a minute, certain thought patterns that they tend to rely upon, then they will be able to say, oh, I'm going with this distorted thought pattern. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do this instead. And you can teach how to identify biased thinking and problem solve objectively based on accurate information. So I wanted you to just take a minute, and hopefully some of you have a paper and a pencil around. And I want you just to take, so that you can feel what I'm talking about. Take get a paper and a pencil. And we're going to do what's called a rapid writing exercise. And the only rule to this is do not stop writing until I say stop. Okay? And I want you to think of a situation which was especially emotional for you. Write down everything you can remember about that situation. What was happening? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What were you doing, etc. Just keep writing. So choose your moment where you had some pretty strong feelings. Got it in your head? Okay, now I want you to start writing about it. What was happening? What were you thinking, feeling, doing, etc. And the only rule, like I said, is that you need to keep going until I tell you to stop. So ready, get set, go. That's great. I see everybody writing. That's great. Don't pick that pencil or pen up. Keep writing. That was only 2 minutes. Probably felt a little longer than that, right? If you want to finish the sentence, because we all are a little anal about it, go ahead and finish whatever sentence you're on. Okay, so let's talk about what I was hoping to achieve there, have you think a little bit. Think of that situation. Think about what your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors are. And where did those automatic thoughts come from? Because again, you didn't come out of the womb with certain expectations, values, etc. Where did they come from? And how did those thoughts influence your subsequent emotions and behaviors during that situation? And honestly, how adaptive were your feelings and behaviors? So what you want to do at some point, whether it's now or whenever, is just go through what you wrote and just circle any parts of it that you think, maybe I wasn't thinking too rationally at that moment. Or maybe here's a way that I tend to behave that's probably not that healthy. Okay. Okay, now when we go into the CBT interventions, you'll see, be able to apply a lot of what I'm trying to impress on you here. So the primary goal of cognitive behavior interventions is to identify those dysfunctional thought patterns and beliefs and to replace them with rational, adaptive thought patterns and beliefs. And the term they use is cognitive restructuring. We're restructuring our cognitions, our thought processes. And there's a real need for individualization with this. There are a lot of really good books out there specific to cognitive behavior interventions with kids on the spectrum or any kind of kids. There's one called Copycat that's really a lot of fun, has a lot of interactions and activities you can do. So I would recommend Copycat for sure. If you Google that, you'll find it. But at the same time, you want to tailor those strategies around the cognitive level and the age of your child. For younger or less verbal kids, less adept kids, you want to go heavier on the behavioral part of it. You know, what are the consequences, reward systems, loss of privileges, whatever, loss of items if for a punishment side of it. You're going to want to use really concrete and simple examples. So less adept kids, you might need to give them something to say. They might need to learn to say, change is okay, change is okay, change is okay, rather than saying, well, you think something more rational, honey. You know, it's a little too vague. You may need to provide, there's mantras, and the example I just gave was a great one. If I had $1 for every kid that I've taught to say change is okay, I'd be a rich woman. It's one of the standards I've gotten in a lot of times. You can use puppets or board games, video clips, etc. Sometimes if you can incorporate whatever the child's passion is, they're going to be more invested. So for instance, if you have a child that's really big into trains, and you can find a Thomas the Tank Engine video clip where somebody is expressing rational thoughts, one of the trains is saying something rational, in a situation that maybe they're keeping themselves from getting angry, boy, use that clip. You know, whatever interest your child has, you want to try to incorporate that as much as possible. So here's the assumption that everybody thinks, or most people think this, is that certain situations make us feel certain emotions. Okay, so that situation made me feel this way. You know, my husband forgot my birthday, so therefore I'm angry. Or which would never happen, of course. I'm married 36 years to the love of my life. Or I have 2 kids that are now 29 and 32. When they were younger, he didn't follow my instructions. That really made me mad. Okay. Here's the thing though. The reality is it's our thoughts about the situations that determine what our emotional response is going to be. So that's why all of us have been in situations where it's the exact same situation, but one person is cracking up, another person is angry, another person is, anxious. It's the exact same situation. And it's all because our thoughts are what determine our emotions, not the situation. And I've got a little graphic here to show you what I mean. So the situation, in between the situation and your emotions are those thoughts. So that's why if somebody is dishonest to me and I feel angry, it's because my thoughts are there should be honest, lying is a horrible thing, blah, blah, blah. Those thoughts are what are leading to the emotions, not the situation of somebody lying to me. Gets even, or let me do this first. So what are you thinking when you see a child look like that? at you. Okay? Say your own kid makes that face at you. Okay? Some people might look at that and say, they might think, that little brat, how dare she? Whatever. Okay? And then there's other people that might look at that and say, God, if I crack up that face, I'm just going to crack up with this kid's face. And I know I'm going to reinforce her doing this and I'm going to see it again. Okay. So the exact same situation can lead to different thoughts, which in turn lead to different feelings. And here's the more complicated way of looking at it, is that the situation leads to thoughts, which in turn leads to feelings, which then leads to child's behavior, which leads to consequences of that behavior. And therefore, the reason thoughts is in red is because that's where you want to target. Because if you can change the way the kid thinks, you're going to change the way they feel, the way they behave, and the consequences of those behaviors. This is an axiom. I use this a lot for kids. And in fact, let me show you this next slide. This is the one I show to kids. And they have, we have booklets, and they go through their booklets, and they have all kinds of different thought patterns and everything in their booklets that they keep track of. And the reason the thoughts is in red and in bold is because that's where we're targeting. And if you ask any kids I do CBT with, what do you need to do? What do you need to change? They'll say, I need to change the way I think in order to change the way I feel. They all know it. That's their, because what I'm drilling with them whenever I see them is, okay, that's a situation, you felt this way. What were your thoughts about that situation? Because that's what we need to change, the way you think about a situation. Now, let me tell you this too, is that every situation is going to be, let me just put it this way. There are certain situations that you're going to have feelings. We're not trying to get rid of kids' negative feelings. You know, I'm doing therapy with a guy right now who's the nicest, sweetest guy in the whole world. And his mom died unexpectedly a year ago, and his dad was just got a terminal diagnosis. Now, good news is he's got extended family and step parents and all that kind of stuff who are wonderful. But this poor kid, and you know, I said, listen, there's nothing you can change about your thoughts that are going to make you feel better, because this is a horrible, horrible situation. It's a very sad situation. So there are, you know, I want to make sure that I'm not telling you or giving the impression that when you're faced or your child is faced with tough situations, that they should just blow it off and, oh, you know, change the way you think. They're going to have tough situations. But what we really want to do is target some of those thoughts where you can say, where am I inadvertent? Where am I unnecessarily having certain feelings and behaviors and consequences because my thoughts are leading to those feelings, that I'm overreacting in one way or the other. All right, so there's another way of looking at it, just one, you know, more than one graphic here, but this is a good one in the sense that it gives you this idea that it's not quite as linear as we saw on that other slide, right? You might have a situation and you have some cognitions, which leads to some behaviors and feelings. Oh, but now the behavior led to some physiological effects, which now made you feel a different way, and now your behavior is changing, and which may change your thoughts. I mean, it's really sort of everything's wrapped up in each other. So it's sort of a complex bag that we all have to deal with. And notice I'm adding the physiological reactions now and the effects. Often when I talk with kids and work with kids, I help them not only recognize what their thoughts are about situations, but also if they have certain feelings, what are their physiological reactions? And what are their initial, especially their initial physiological reactions? Because if they can identify that there's initial physical cues that they're starting to get upset, then they're going to be more effective. For instance, years ago, I worked with a teenage girl that would say, when she was starting to get upset, she'd say, my teeth hurt, my teeth hurt. And we took her to the dentist and we made sure there was nothing going on. And it turned out she would clench her jaw when she was getting upset. There was initial cues. And it was by being able to identify that, she got to say, oh, to herself, oh, I'm clenching my jaw, I'm starting to get upset. And then she would say, I'm starting to get upset. And people could calm her down early in that chain rather than it being, she's you know, throwing things and screaming and getting aggressive. So knowing what those physiological cues are. Sometimes I work with kids where their stomach hurts or they get a headache, or maybe they start to stim a little bit more when they're starting to get upset. If you can pinpoint them, it's an easier way of starting catching the child early in the behavior change chain and helping them calm down then, rather than trying to calm them down when they're already escalated, because it's just not going to work when they're there. So let me talk to you about some common distorted thought patterns that are seen, and this isn't specific to autism. This is if you look up any book out there, anything online about cognitive behavior therapy or cognitive behavior interventions, this is taken from those kind of sources. It's sort of a generic way of looking at people in general. What are some of those common distorted thought patterns? So count on that you're going to see some of these and go, that's a me right there. You know, that's okay. That's normal. We all have distorted thought patterns. One of them is you hold other people responsible for your own pain, or you blame yourself for other people's, excuse me, problems. So that blaming, right, is a really common distorted thought pattern. You take a situation and you're immediately like, whose fault is it? I'm looking for somebody to blame it on. Next one is catastrophizing. You assume disaster is right around the corner and you're constantly worrying about what if. Being a parent, this comes with the territory a lot of times, right? Being a parent of a kid with autism, you might get yourself caught in this. Catastrophizing, oh my gosh, he's 5 years old and he's still not toilet trained. Oh my gosh, he's going to be 35 years old and he's still going to be in diapers, you know, whatever. You lead it into this catastrophic scenario. You assume that catastrophic scenario is going to happen. Next one is called the fallacy of change. And this means you expect others to change if you can just convince them to do so. And you won't be happy until these changes take place. And I have the link there. That I'm not sure if that link still is true, but if you look up a typical conversation with my mom and I don't like fish on YouTube, you'll have a fun time, because it's this little 3 or 4 minute video. And it's just about how this adult child is talking to his mom, and the mom's saying, oh, we're going out, you know, listen, I'm making some tuna. Would you like some tuna? And the kid says, the young adult says, no, I don't like fish. Oh, but this is really good tuna. It's got celery in it. And it's really, you know, yeah, I know, Mom, but I don't like fish. Yeah, but it's got, you know, tuna is really good for you. And but yeah, I know, Mom, but I don't like fish. You know, where the mom's just trying so hard to get the kid to change. And I got to tell you, my daughter sent me that YouTube link. So clearly that's something I need to work on. When, as parents, there are times where we expect our kids to change at a time where perhaps they're not ready to change, or we want them to, I don't know, do something that's a little bit hard for them or beyond their ability at the time. And then for the kids, a lot of our kids are very rigid thinkers, where it's either black and white. So an example of this would be, this might be true for some of your kids, is one of the kids in the classroom breaks a rule and your kid is just, you know, ready to send the kid to the, you know, to the death chamber or whatever. You don't break a rule. You gotta follow the rule all the time. And so all they want to do is, he's got to stop breaking the rules, or she's got to stop breaking the rules. The reality is, when I help kids with this, is to say, you can only control your own behavior. You can't control the other child's behavior. You need to just focus on your own behavior. But that's a great example of that fallacy of change, where they think, like, if I only tell my peer 5,000 times that they're not supposed to call out without raising their hand, they will stop, okay, or they need to stop. So that's called fallacy of change. The next one is called fallacy of control. And that's that idea of, you know, what control do you have over what's going on around you? Some people are very internally control, in the sense that they feel like they can completely control their destiny or what's going on. And then some big folks and kids just say, I have no control. And the reality, obviously, is there's something in between there. Another one is fallacy of fairness. And this is, you don't understand why life isn't fair and resent when others do not agree with your own definition or perception of fairness. Well, a lot of kids on the spectrum are all about fairness, right? She had 2 more potato chips than I did. That's not fair, blah, blah, blah. That graphic that I have on there is actually a kindergarten book, and it's all about teaching kids to be fair. And frankly, I hate it, because it perpetuates that belief that life's always going to be fair, and life's not always going to be fair. If anything, kids need to learn to adapt them when things aren't fair, because fairness, frankly, is preference. You know, it's my preference that I have as many potato chips as that other kid. Next one mind reading without anyone telling you. You think you know what others are feeling or why they are acting a certain way. And this is a lot of kids on the spectrum are really, really prone to fall into this one. And I think it makes sense because, as we all know, one of the main gaps with our kids is the ability to take somebody else's perspective. So it's given that gap, it's not uncommon for kids on the spectrum to make assumptions about what somebody else is feeling or thinking. And because they're not good at picking up on social cues, or they're not good on picking up on contextual cues. So they jump to conclusions about what somebody might be feeling. And just an interesting aside, there was some really neat research done a while back where they looked at what are called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are neurons in your brain, your central nervous system. And we all have mirror neurons. And mirror neurons mean that when you watch somebody else do something, your brain reacts as if you're doing it. You know, classic example is, the scientist with the observing the monkeys, and the monkeys have, brain electrodes, looking at what parts of the brain are activated different with different activities or different situations. And lo and behold, the scientist starts eating, their lunch, and the monkey's brain lights up as if they were eating. And it's that sense of, I watch somebody else do something, my brain's getting activated as if I'm doing that activity. And the reason I bring this up is because there's been some subsequent research to show that some kids on the spectrum don't have a lot of those mirror neurons. And if you think about it, that's empathy. That you'd be able to, ability to take somebody else's perspective. And I often tell parents about this because it shows that our kids aren't trying to be rude or obnoxious or drive you crazy, right? A lot of them just don't have the physiological foundation to be able to take other people's perspective. And that doesn't mean they can't learn it, but it just means that it doesn't necessarily come naturally because the way their brain is wired doesn't facilitate that ability to take other people's perspective. Okay, next one. Jump into conclusions, overgeneralization. You take one incident and assume this is the way it's going to be. And I've seen parents do that in the sense that, oh, I took them out to, to dinner at a restaurant. All hell broke loose. It was horrible, worst experience. We're never going to a restaurant again. I've seen it with kids where, again, that rigid black and white thinking that a lot of our kids fall into, where they might say, oh, are you going to go out for a play? No, I went out for a play. I'm now a middle schooler and I went out, I was in a play in second grade and it was horrible. I, fell flat on my face and everybody laughed. And now they are years later, not going to do that again. So the overgeneralization is not uncommon with our kids. You assume everything others do or say has something to do with you. I'm the center of the universe, right? That's called personalization. I've seen it with parents where they go into a setting, maybe they're at a family reunion and somebody scowls and they say, oh, they're scowling because, I just brought my kid in with autism, and maybe it has nothing to do with your kid with autism. Just that ability to be able to broaden your lens. We're not all quite that important. You see everything in black and white with no middle ground, polarized thinking. Again, that's a real common situation with kids on the spectrum. Either something's all good or all bad, or all right or all wrong. And I even have kids do things where they, literally color things in gray to show that that there's no black and white in the world. Next one is called reward fallacy. And that means you think your good deeds should be rewarded and resent it when others do not reciprocate. Sometimes when I set up reward systems, which I'm a big believer in reward systems, parents will be like, oh, but then he's going to want to be rewarded for everything. And there are times where kids will jump into it and be like, Mom, I just picked up my fork and took one bite. Where's my reward? Whatever. My kids kid around because I overdid it in terms of praising them and everything when they were little, that they will say, nice breathing. So that's how I was praising them for nice breathing. But here's the thing. When you do a reward system, you don't say, oh, I'm not going to do a reward system because my kid's going to want a reward all the time. You say, okay, how do we teach the child to understand the rewards are for these behaviors, but not every other behavior? And the way you do that is you delineate specifically what rewards or what behaviors you're targeting. You don't just say good behavior. You say good behavior means playing nicely with your sister, eating all your dinner, whatever you want to identify. And then when the child does something outside that list, you give them praise, you give them high fives, but you have a rule that if the child asks for the reward, you don't get it. So it gets children past that idea of everything I do should get a reward. Shoulds are a big part of irrational thinking and expectations. The world should go this way, or people should do this. And tongue in cheek, it says your own list of should be adopted by everyone. So if you hear the word should in your child's vocabulary, or you hear it in your own thought processes, have a little bit of a red flag go up. Next one is called emotional reasoning. And this means that whatever you feel must be true. And the example here is, I feel so stupid because, I feel stupid, therefore I am stupid. And kids on the spectrum, it's not uncommon for them to make assumptions about themselves based on how they might be feeling at a given time. And parents too. Next one is called global labeling. And this means you generalize your own or another person's one or two qualities into a global negative judgment. And that it does, you see that with kids on the spectrum, where a child, maybe one of their peers has a bad day and acts up at school. Well, from then on, that kid is a bad kid in your child's mind. Or a teacher says, isn't particularly responsive to the child, and the child says, oh, they're a bad teacher. So you want to make sure that you teach your kids that, one or two incidences doesn't lead to a global personality trait of somebody. Being right. I always kid around that my now deceased mother-in-law should be on here, because she died at 94 and was never wrong her entire life. It was really quite an accomplishment. And you are continually on trial to prove that your opinions and actions are correct. Being wrong is unthinkable, and you go to great lengths to demonstrate your rightness. A lot of kids on the spectrum don't know when to back off. I worked with a kid one time that got in trouble because he was a teenage kid, was in general ed, doing really, really good things, but very black and white and very much got to be right. And he was leaving the cafeteria one time at school, and he took a bag of chips or something and put it in his pocket as he walked out. And the cafeteria aide said, wait a minute, you can't steal, you have to pay for them. You have to go back and pay for them. You can't steal them. And the kid said, well, you can't prove a criminal intent because I hadn't left the cafeteria yet. Okay. So the aide says, what? You can't prove criminal intent. Thinks he's a wise guy, takes him to the principal. Principal says, blah, blah, blah. Kid says, but you can't prove criminal intent. I didn't leave the cafeteria yet. He's just stating the facts, right? He's right in his mind. And he's going to just keep pushing that, thinking that it's going to change people. And in fact, when he came to my office and we were role playing it and we videotaped it, and I was the principal and he was himself, and he started saying, but you can't prove criminal intent. And so when we went back and watched the videotape, he's watching and he said, I look arrogant. And I said, yeah, buddy, you do. That's really good. You figured that out. And he said, I was just talking slower because he was not picking up on how right I was. And I figured if I talked slower, he'd finally understand, right? So it was really good for him to figure out how his presentation was actually getting him in trouble, and to recognize, sometimes you got to back off. You don't have to be right all the time. Next one, negative thinking, disqualifying the positive. A lot of kids on the spectrum are very much perfectionists. And boy, I've worked with kids that, especially with writing, because writing can be tough for kids, they'll start writing and then they don't like exactly what they write. So they start erasing it, and they're erasing it so much that now the paper is getting torn and they're starting all over. I'm going to throw this out, and I forget it. I'm not going to do this. So sometimes kids on the spectrum will focus on the negative and ignore the good. And honestly, a lot of people in the world do that anyway. You get an evaluation from your boss and you're doing good and blah, 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 blah. Oh, there's the one little area of growth where you focus on that, you over exaggerate that. You can also sometimes take a positive and spin it into a negative. Next one is comparing. You're constantly comparing your own performance with others as if there is some kind of ongoing competition, and you're worrying that people will eventually realize that you're not as good. For kids on the spectrum, where I see this is more like in middle school and high school. When they're younger, they tend not to recognize that they're perhaps a little different than their peers. But as they get to middle school and high school, all of a sudden it might be a little bit more obvious, and they start comparing. And you know, all of us for teenage years, you know, it can be a tough time in terms of you want to look like everybody else, smell like everybody else, talk like everybody else, etc. And meanwhile, if you're on the spectrum, you've got this difficulty in understanding social interactions and peer expectations, things like that. So you sort of feel, some kids I work with feel less than, as far as feeling like they're comparing themselves with their peers and not doing as well. And it can be very tough for kids. And a lot of times with kids on the spectrum, teenagers especially, part of my work with them is to help them recognize that that their thought processes in terms of having to be exactly the same or having to be in the popular group or whatever, that every teenager is having that same thought process, and sort of helping them normalize it a little bit so they don't take it, they don't exaggerate or take it too seriously. Self-justification, you're always able to come up with multiple reasons as to why you did what you did and why your actions were justified given the circumstances. A lot of kids on the spectrum say they get in trouble because they've done something wrong, or say they, you know, did something that maybe was rude. A lot of our kids on the spectrum will just say the facts and rude. Why did you buy me this Christmas present? I wouldn't want this, to grandma. You know, they're, again, just stating the facts. And so, but I was just saying the facts. Mom, you told me to always be honest. I'm being honest, right? And they stick with that argument about that they were justifying what they did. Unduly optimistic. This is the one that I fall into, frankly. Some other ones as well, but this one, my husband kids around that I could be in the epicenter of a nuclear blast and say, oh, good, I don't have to worry about getting a tan. I'm pathologically able to spin a negative until it's a positive. But this is being unduly optimistic regarding your chances, for instance, of getting caught or being affected by your own actions, and generally believe that you are invulnerable. So some kids on the spectrum don't get it, that they are vulnerable, that physically vulnerable, especially. I worked with a kid last year that was climbing on their neighbor's roof, you know, with nobody around until the police were called, etc. So that unduly optimistic attitude is something to address. A lot of kids want instant gratification. And some of you might know this experiment's a very, very well-known experiment where they gave little ones, 5- and 6-year-olds, they said you can have 1 marshmallow now or wait for 30 minutes and you can have 3 marshmallows. And it was a way of testing the child's ability to delay that gratification. And then they followed those kids, and the kids that were able to wait the 30 minutes to get all 3 tended to do better at school, tended to do better with social relationships, etc. So it's, you know, it's a really, really good skill to learn to as early on as possible. Of that, waiting can sometimes get you a bigger reward, bigger buck for long-term benefits. Confusing wants versus needs. So a lot of kids on the spectrum will say, but I you know, I need that new Thomas the Tank Engine or I'm gonna die. You know, it's a preference, not an actual need. Victim identification, which is some kids will perceive, or parents will perceive themselves as the perpetual victim of circumstances that they never get a chance. Okay, good. So we bounced through about, I don't know, 20, something like that. Sorry, about 20 or so possible distorted thought patterns. My guess is there were some that sounded like they hit home for yourself or your spouse or your mother-in-law or your kid. And that's just a very, you know, it's not all inclusive. If you go online and you write in cognitive behavior therapy and distorted thought patterns, there'll be even more. There's a ton of them out there. That's just to give you a sort of a general idea of some of the ones we tend to fall into. So let's relate this to children on the autism spectrum. So keep in mind, this is where we're going back to that diagnostic criteria. The hallmarks of autism spectrum disorder: perseverative thinking, poor social skills, insistence on sameness, rigidity of thought, poor perspective taking, etc. So can you see how those tendencies linked to the diagnosis could lead to some distorted thought patterns? And I'm going to take a break, not take a break, but stop the PowerPoints here for a minute and ask you, what thoughts might a child be thinking which exacerbates the situation? So my question here really is, how do those diagnostic criteria that we talked about, why do you think that makes it more likely the kids on the spectrum are going to have distorted thought patterns? So feel free, if you have a comment or an insight, to unmute yourself and share it with the group. No brave souls out there? Okay, I'll let you off though. All right. Anybody want to guess what some of the most common distorted thought patterns that you've seen with kids on the spectrum? Some of the ones we talked about? Or I'll let you off the hook and just go straight to it. Ready? Okay, so here are some of the most common thought patterns that you want to teach kids. So the ones we just went through are some of the distorted thought patterns. Now I'm going to teach you or tell you what some of the most common adaptive thoughts that I have taught kids on the spectrum, and other people in the field have taught kids on the spectrum. So first one is change is okay. Like I said, my gosh, if I had $1 for every kid I've taught change is okay, I'd be a rich, rich woman. Excuse me. The best example I always think of, and it's one of those days that I feel like, oh man, this is so cool, is that I worked with I think he was about 14 years old when I first met him, a kid on the spectrum that would get totally bent out of shape if there was a change. The mother took a different route home because there was construction, or changes at school, or changes in season. A lot of kids have trouble with the seasonal changes because now we're going from short sleeves to long sleeve. Oh, now we're back to short sleeves again come the spring. I mean, that kind of change that all of us have learned to adapt to can be very difficult for our kids. So like I have assembly at school, taking a different route to the store, changes in physical environment, switching clothing across seasons. So this particular kid I'm thinking about, we worked really hard on teaching him just to repeat to himself, change is okay, change is okay. We wrote it on little 3x5 cards as a cheat sheet that he could just read it over and over again as a way of getting the thought into his head. And he did really, really well. And we ended up discontinuing therapy, all is well, go on your way. Maybe 2 or 3 years later, I was at a parent support group and I ran into his parents, hadn't seen them in all this time. And, big, oh, how are you doing? How's your boy? Blah, blah, blah. And the mom said, this is perfect timing. And I said, why? And she said, well, last week we were driving in the car and the mom and dad were in the front seat and the kid was in the back seat. And the mom and dad were having this conversation sort of, on their own. And the mom was talking about how she had gotten a promotion at work, and she was very nervous whether or not she was going to be able to, rise to the occasion of this promotion. And she was anxious about it. And lo and behold, the kid for the back seat leans forward, does this on her shoulder and says, "It's okay, Mom, change is okay." I was like, yes, not only are you've incorporated it, but you're helping the rest of the world recognize the change is okay, because it's changed. I mean, here we are on Zoom because there's a freaking global pandemic. If we haven't learned to adapt over the last 10 years, or the last year, we better now. All right, next one. No big deal. I've worked with a lot of kids to tell themselves that's a really rational thought. This is no big deal. Being able to prioritize situations rather than getting overreacting over minor situations. And I have there, some of you might have seen before, the incredible 5-point scale. If you haven't seen it, get that paper book. It's a little paperback book. It's a little booklet. Go online. There are worksheets you can do, and it basically helps kids to rate situations in terms of how important they are. And you can use the incredible 5-point scale for anything. You can use it for how angry am I? You can use it for how important is this? You can use it for, what are the chances of such and such happening? It's what's really cool about the scale is once a child learns that idea of a gradacious scale of 1 to 5, they can apply it to just about anything. So in these circumstances where the kid's overreacting to a minor event, teaching them to be able to say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, the fact that I got 2 less potato chips is a 1, right? And what you'll probably saying is, oh yeah, but my kid's going to say it's a 5. Obviously, it's a skill to learn. So what I usually do with kids is we start with that 5-point scale, and we have, I talk to the kids and we fill in, well, what is an example of a 1? What is an example of a 2? And I especially want to know what's an example of a 5. And I make sure that that 5 is something that most people would rate as a 5. Grandpa died, the dog died, you know, I had to switch schools, you know, something that's pretty life impacting. And so then when the child, you say the child, where are you going to rate getting 2 less potato chips? And the child says it's a 5. Then you go, well, you know what, you're saying that's the same as grandpa dying. Is that really what you mean here? And it helps kids come up with an idea of rating the priority of situations so they're less apt to overreact. Because the reality is, what you teach kids is, if you rate it as a 1, your reaction's a 1. If you rate it as a 3, your reaction's a 3. And what I've done is I've taken that column and I put a 3rd column in there to say, what should your behavior look like? Contingent on whatever level 1 through 5 that you've designated it. So a behavior response for a 1 might be shrugging your shoulders and walking away. An example of a response to a 3 might be taking a 5-minute break and, you know, taking some deep breaths. Okay. The other thing, just on a more basic level, is I've taught kids little things versus big things. Just, you know, not even going the full 5, but just going big or little. And just teaching kids that if it's a big thing, it's okay if your reaction's big. If it's a little thing, your reaction should be little. And again, it's a learning process. So the example I always think of is a kid I worked with years ago, where he's very upset because his older brother had thrown his underwear into this kid's bedroom. And he got very upset, and he had a tantrum for a good hour or so. So when I saw him, I said, well, you know, let's say, okay, brother threw something, his underwear into your room. Is that a little thing or a big thing? And he said, well, it was pretty big underwear. You know, so no, we need to work on this a little bit more. So it's a skill set. It's the same way you teach anything else. All of these are skills. Teaching kids, you know, cognitive behavior interventions is really a skill building focus. Okay, another thing I've taught kids to say to themselves as a rational thought is, you can't always get what you want. So there's kids that want that instant gratification or want people to change, other people to change, all that kind of stuff. You can't always get your want. And I've taught them the Rolling Stones song, you know, I just might get what you need, right? It helps kids with ASD to cope with denial of preferred items or activities. It teaches them delayed gratification and accepting no. Because if there are 2 skills that are often on IEPs or on treatment plans, it's waiting and accepting no. Because a lot of kids with autism have a lot of trouble with both of those behaviors. So saying to yourself, you can't always get what you want, can help you wait, and it can help you accept a denied access, a denied item that you want. It can also be used in terms of daily schedules. You can use daily schedules or other visual supports to let the child know when the desired item will be available. So you can't have it right now, but here's the daily schedule. Let me get my orientation. Okay, so we're here on the daily schedule, and this is when we have recess. So we have to do X, Y, and Z, and then you get recess. Or in home, you know, getting ready in the morning, you brush your teeth, you get dressed, you eat your breakfast, then you have television. So having that picture schedule can help children understand that you're not getting it right now, but it's coming. Or you could have a stop sign. I'm sure a lot of you have used this visual support. Use a stop sign of when something's available, and then you turn the sign and it says, you know, it's a green circle, say, for yes, you can have it. It's available. And teaching kids to just see that sign instead of nagging you, because what happens is if they continue to nag you, sooner or later, for instance, it is recess time. And they're going to think it's the nagging that got them recessed, not the fact that the world was just moving in that direction in that sequence already. Another thing I've asked or taught kids to say to themselves or to prompt themselves is to say, I need to ask for help. Many kids, especially the more adept kids, when they're in middle school and high school, they don't want to stand out. So they don't want to ask for help. And so teaching them that it's okay to ask for help is a really, really important cognition to impress upon them. They might get frustrated because they're finding something to be too challenging. Or when a child with ASD does not understand social expectations, it's okay to ask for help. A kid I'm seeing for therapy right now, he described his social situation with peers and that he didn't understand. And he told me it in detail. He described it in detail, and it seemed like a legitimate description. And I said, you know what, I got to tell you, I don't understand it either. You know, social situations are very confusing. 2 and 2 is always 4. Social situations are so dependent upon the context and who's involved and what time of day it is and what exactly did you say and what was happening before. All those variables make every social situation a very difficult ability to interpret what's going on just because of all those factors. So asking for help is perfectly fine, the same way that you might ask your spouse for help about something that happened at work. You know, I'm just not sure what happened with this social situation with my boss today. So helping your kids recognize that it's okay to ask for help is okay. Another thing that I've taught kids is life isn't always fair. We've talked about that earlier when we went through that one. And when they're expecting things to balance out, or if they've seen some injustice has occurred, I teach kids to say, life isn't always fair. It's okay. Life isn't always fair. Sometimes it works out. That's okay. Life isn't always fair. You know, just sort of repetitively give them, and again, write a script if that helps, as a visual support, as a way of getting that script in there. I've worked with kids where we've made laminated cue card sheets, and each on a bungee cord, kind of a key ring, and then they turn, and each one has life isn't always fair, or, you know, I can ask for help, or change is okay, and whatever ones you've come up with. And again, these are not all inclusive either. These are just examples of ones I've used a lot, where you can have the child, you're driving in the car, maybe they're going through that, flipping through that bungee cord array of cues, just to, during neutral times, get it through their head. Because if the only time you're trying to instill those rational thoughts into your child's head is when they're upset, it's not going to work. It needs to be taught during neutral times, so that when the child starts to show those overreactions, etc., that you can remind them of the rational thoughts that they've practiced during neutral times. Another thing I've taught kids to say is to ask other people, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? It's okay to ask other people rather than jumping into mind reading, etc. And it helps kids on the spectrum to get a better handle on how to interpret other people's perspective and interpret other people's feelings. Teach them to say, I can try again. So there's kids that are jumping to conclusions or black and white thinking, I'm never going to do that again, or overgeneralization. I can try it again. Everyone has their own opinion. So it's okay that somebody doesn't think SpongeBob's the greatest thing in the world, or doesn't care about, you know, I've worked with kids that have some pretty unusual passions, and it's really hard for them to find somebody else that's into it. I worked with a teenage girl years ago, a really cool kid, one of my favorite kids, and she was big into Star Wars. And the great news is a lot of kids are into Star Wars. So she would go online and all these websites of fandom and Star Wars, etc. And she told me it's great to go on them because I'm not the weird autistic kid, is how she put it. I'm just one of the other people that are really into Star Wars. So that's good as far as making sure that you have the connection with people that are have the same passions. But at the same time, you have to recognize not everybody's big into Star Wars, and that's okay. Let the data be my guide. It's common, especially when kids get into that catastrophizing pattern that we talked about, or, you know, the perfectionistic kind of thing. Oh, I'm going to fail, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but look at your grades. Show them the data. You can use that black and white thinking and that objective way of interpreting the world to your benefit by saying to them, hey, let's look at the data. I had a kid one time that was afraid. He wasn't sick or anything, but he was afraid he was going to die. So I said, okay, let's go online. Chances of a 9-year-old healthy boy dying, it was like 0.001%. He went, oh, okay. He was done with it. So sometimes giving those statistics, showing graphs, etc., can be fun. Think of something good, teaching kids how to think, focus on something and shift their focus. Sometimes that's the easiest thing, just a distraction onto something that they find appealing. I worked with a child one time I was throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this kid, trying to get him to adopt some more rational thoughts, and it was just getting nowhere. And one time he came to see me, and in the beginning he said, oh, did you see that new Angry Birds movie? So that'll date it. It's quite a few years back. Did you see the new Angry Birds? Oh, let me show you this clip. It's so funny from the preview, blah, blah, blah. And he shows me the silly clip from it. And he was in such a great mood. I said, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to print out a little picture of that scene, of the Angry Birds scene. and we're going to laminate it and we're going to put it on the inside of your agenda at school. Because this kid's biggest problem was he would get so anxious about tests and things like that, that he would just do poorly on the test because he was so anxious. So by putting that Angry Birds picture in there, when he would sit down to take a test, he'd open up his agenda and then he'd be feeling anxious and he'd look at the Angry Birds, he'd chuckle, and it would distract him by thinking about that instead. So let's talk about techniques on how to, we've talked about some distorted thought patterns that the child might have. We've talked about some alternative adaptive thoughts that you might want to teach your children. Now we're going to talk about how do you get that actual teaching done. And as I said earlier, do it during neutral times. You can bring it up during when you start to see those initial cues. Again, not when you think of a bell curve, they call it the rage cycle, where it's rumbling, the kid's starting to get upset, then that goes up and they're way up here and escalated. That's the rage part of it. And then the end part is recovery. You can try to catch the kids in the rumbling part to help them think rationally at that moment. Because if they're already up here, again, they're not going to hear a word you say. So catching them early to say, oh, looks like you're starting to get upset. What's a positive thought you can think? Don't forget to say change is okay, or whatever you want to prompt to help catch them early. And of course, as I said, during neutral times as well. Challenging some of those core beliefs, you need to be sensitive to the fact that the core beliefs may be important to the child based on their own experiences, even if you don't agree or disagree or understand. There are some kids that, boy, they just are so adamant about something that it's really, really hard to get them to think differently or be flexible about it. Don't tell them what to think. Let them teach them how to decide what to think and help them recognize that their choice of thoughts are leading to the feelings and the behaviors. And recognize that our kids aren't going to see the world the same way as we do. I mean, their whole experience is different. A couple of things about self-talk to keep in mind. One is that if you're teaching a mantra, if you're teaching the child adaptive thoughts to say, better to, as much as possible, put the word I in there. So better to say I can be brave than to say the dark isn't scary. Because those self-affirming statements that have the I in there tend to be a little bit more long-lasting, a little bit more effective. And you can start by the child saying these adaptive thoughts out loud and then fade to that they're saying it and whispering it and then internally talking to themselves. And keeping those new automatic thoughts, especially initially, frankly, I don't care if the kid's saying it out loud, because you want them to not only think it, but to hear it because they're saying it out loud, and then you can fade it to be more discreet. This is a technique you can use where you're helping the child identify those bad thoughts. It's called the downward arrow technique. And you just start with if. And if, for instance, in this case, if I can't finish the math quiz in time, you say to the child, okay, what's going to happen next? I'm going to get an F. Okay, what's going to happen next? Which means I'm stupid. Okay, what's going to happen next? I'll have to switch math classes and get used to a new teacher and classmates. Okay, and then what's going to happen? And my parents will think I'm a failure. So see how not finishing the math quiz in time has led this kid to thinking that he's going to get kicked out, and his parents are going to think he's a failure. So helping kids follow that arrow and recognize, okay, where am I going to cut off the arrow? Where am I going to stop that escalation? I've worked with kids that, have different passions, say a volcano. You can do, use whatever their passion is. It's a volcano, okay? And so if you have, the first thought is, I can't finish the math quiz, then I'll get an F, which means I'm stupid. I'll have to switch math classes, and my parents will think I'm a failure, right? So help them to recognize how the advantages of keeping that volcano from growing, and any other analogy you can come up with. Another way is to start with just two simple associations. Where, this is the example, where and what's the behavior. So the where is at the bus stop. The behavior is I don't talk to anyone. Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit deeper. Where's the bus stop? The thoughts are, if I open my mouth, I'm going to sound stupid, which makes the child feel sad, scared, and lonely, which the behavior is stand by myself and I don't talk to anyone. So just doing these graphics sometimes can help kids recognize how a neutral situation, standing at the bus stop, is influenced by their thoughts, which in turn leads to feelings and certain behaviors. So you can teach them different ways of replacing. So instead of thinking, if I open my mouth, I'll sound stupid, you could, cross that out and instead say, I can say certain things, and I'm a pretty smart kid, which will make my feelings will be calm and relaxed, and the behavior will be I'll start interacting with kids and I'll make some friends. So see how this is the status quo, and you want to teach the child to replace those thoughts and then help them recognize that that will change the feelings and the behavior. You can do worksheets. We talked about the amazing, it's incredible 5-point scale, big and little importance. I do workshops with that. There's social detective worksheets if you haven't seen them yet. Carol Gray is a big proponent of that. And there's another woman, I'm blanking on her name, that does a lot of what they call social detective worksheets. If you go online, you Google it, you'll see. And what they do is social detective worksheets help kids analyze a social situation, and you say to them, oh, you're the detective, you're going to get out your magnifying glass and try to figure out what are the aspects of this social situation and what are your thoughts about it. Visual supports, you all know, with kids on the spectrum, the best way to get any information in their head is through their eyes, not through their ears. And we rely on talking. What am I doing? I'm talking blah, 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 right? So when you're talking to your children, and especially if they're starting to get upset, children on the autism spectrum, as we saw from the beginning, have trouble with communication and understanding what people are saying. So if a child's starting to get escalated and you rely solely upon talking, you've now layered on another pressure of, I'm already feeling upset and now she's talking to me and I have, having trouble following her, that's difficult for me anyway, and it's probably going to escalate the situation. So providing different kinds of visual supports is going to be more effective. So if you haven't seen video modeling or heard about it, jump into it. It's a lot of fun. It's basically where you make a video of somebody demonstrating a behavior that you want your child to learn, and then the child watches the video. So you could have, for instance, a child say that overreacts to, say, a fire drill. And so you could tape a kid that your child knows and likes saying, or it could even be a TSS. I mean, you could be anybody as saying to themselves, oh, the fire drill's going off soon, but that's okay, I can handle it. So they're talking out loud. They're saying those rational thoughts out loud on the tape. And then, the fire alarm goes off and you go off and you're outside and you're saying, okay, I put on my earphone so that got the noise to be lower. I handled it. Oh, I'm so proud of myself. All that kind of self-talk that you want your child to say, have this actor in your video show those and display those thoughts and appropriate behaviors. And then your child watches the video. And while they're watching, you don't say a word. You don't go, well, see how he put the headphones on and now he's walking quietly down the hall. No, you don't say a word. Just let the child watch, because our kids learn visually. And by watching other people do those things and out loud saying those thoughts that you want your child to learn how to say, it can be effective. Cue cards we talked about a lot, movie clips we talked about, music sometimes, whether it's the Rolling Stones, Can't Always Get You What You Want. I worked with a kid one time, his passion was baseball, and he made up his own song on his own because he liked music, that he would say, I can stay relaxed, I can stay relaxed, because he's doing the Star Spangled Banner, which is before the games, of course. And after he finished singing, he'd go, which was supposed to be the clapping, right, of the applause of the crowd. So use music if you can get that. I mean, I know every lyric to every Motown song that ever happened. That's still in my brain someplace. So if you can get some positive thoughts in a musical, that's lyrics to a music that the kid likes, go for it. Using a thoughts journal for kids that are more adept as far as writing, etc. You'd have them write down what was the situation, have them identify the distorted thought that happened, what the exact thoughts that they felt, what kind of distorted thought was it, in those categories that we went through, alternative thoughts that they might feel think instead. And I meant to say this, in the part of the PowerPoints where it had all those kinds of distorted thought patterns, I actually print that out as a handout for kids, and I have your basic 3 slides per page with some lines next to it. And I have the kids, first time I meet them, go through that and rate themselves on how, on say a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale, depending upon how adept the kid is, on how often they fall into that pattern. And that helps me prioritize which kinds of thought processes that I'm going to zero in on with this particular child. And it helps them start to recognize and self-monitor what kind of distorted thought patterns they tend to fall into. Couple of things just to keep in mind as far as adaptive responses to emotional upsets. If they're at that rage cycle, if they're at the top of that, if they're too emotional to analyze at the time, you can just prompt some deep breaths, removing themselves from the situation, having them count to 10 or 20 or 30, whatever it takes, and then go back and evaluate any distorted thought patterns. Because again, they're not going to be able to do that in the midst of an escalation. And as I've been saying all along is, if you can catch those initial cues prior to the escalation, you're going to be much more effective at decreasing the chance the escalation will happen. So know your kid, share with each other what their behavioral cues are. Hey, honey, I noticed today that he tends to rock a little bit more vigorously when he's starting to get upset. Or, the girl with the my teeth hurt situation, or any other kind of subtle little cues where you need to jump in there then and prompt the rational thinking as much as possible. And some simple relaxation techniques, because you'll see in the next slide this idea of it's all thoughts, but you also need to make sure your body's relaxed, and deliberately demonstrate the opposite behavior. So for instance, if a kid tends to pace when they're upset, help them to sit still. If a kid tends to, the hand flapping increases when they're starting to get upset, teach them to do this, because this is telling the brain, oh, I thought I was getting upset, but I've got my hands clasped. I'm not hand flapping, so I must not be as upset as I thought. Remember, we had that one graphic with the arrows, cognitions, behavior, physiological, that's all sort of interplaying with each other. That can work too. And then, as I said, practicing relaxation is really, really important. This idea of teaching kids during neutral times, and there's a really neat, it's ABA based, but it's called ACT, A-C-T. Check it out, because it has a lot of mindfulness incorporated into traditional ABA interventions. And a big part of it is teaching kids how to relax, physiologically relax, how to teach them to relax muscle groups and take deep breathing. And that in itself will calm down their thought processes as well. Okay, so good. I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions and answers. And it looks like we're going to have about 15 minutes, which is good. So my final comments are just that, again, research has shown over and over again that cognitive behavioral interventions can be highly successful across a wide variety of populations and presenting problems, including kids on the spectrum. And using these kind of strategies in conjunction with ABA is your most comprehensive way of leading to success. And as I have the thinker there, for yourselves, for your kids, recognize that we are what we think. All of our feelings, our behaviors, etc., are linked to how we think about situations. The situation doesn't make us feel anyway. It's our thoughts about the situation that leads to those thoughts, or the feelings rather, sorry. All right, I'm going to do this and stop sharing so we can actually have some time for conversation. So anything in the chat box? It looks like we've got a couple of things. Oh, good. So Lakin said she's going to be sending out the PowerPoint, which is great. Like I said, hopefully it'll be helpful for you, because I did throw a whole lot of information at you in a relatively brief amount of time.
If anyone has questions and they want to unmute and ask, that's fine. Or if anyone has questions and put in the chat box, I can read them out loud as well.
Anything that you need clarification, any examples that you can think of where CBT would relate to your own child, whatever you think.
This is Kristen Yost. First off, thank you so very much, because your insight has been spot on for both of my children.
Cool, thank you.
My question is regarding the teenagers, as you mentioned multiple times. Do you have any suggestions on anything that worked better for them? My son's level 1 and really struggles with the social interaction and all of that, and
Right.
has very many of the bad thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, teenage years are tough for everybody, you know, and then you layer on the autism where social interpretations or interpretation of social situations and things like that is so tough. Does your child have any kind of opportunities for learning about social situations, like a social skills group or itinerant autistic support
He
services?
he only,
Hmm?
he only sees a therapist at the moment, but I am looking into getting him into CBT.
Good, good.
My daughter is just recently started CBT, and she's 11 and more challenged than he is, but
Yeah.
all the examples are just phenomenal, and I feel very small because I didn't think of them.
Oh, you know what? This is not, you know, human nature to think this way. Human nature is a situation made you feel a certain way, period. That's all there is to it. So don't be beating yourself up. As far as the teenage years, especially, a couple things. One is that it's okay if your kid's not a social butterfly. You know, a lot of parents, and I don't know if this is true for you, obviously, but a lot of parents I've worked with, especially when the kid's a teenager, want the kid to join every club at school and, you know, have a whole bunch of friends and all that kind of business. And it's often for the parents' needs more than the child's needs. So I would say in general, you want to have maybe one or two good friends, you know, and not expect a child on the spectrum to have much more than that. But you want those couple of friendships to be real friendships and deeper friendships, and teaching your child the benefits of those deeper friendships is a really, really important skill to learn. But as far as the teenage years too, you want to make sure that, you know, I take it back. The third one we're doing in 2 weeks from tonight, the third workshop is surviving puberty. So make sure you watch that one, come for that one.
I was going to tag that on at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I want to tell you, for those of you that are coming next week as well, I'm going to be talking about coping skills, and I talk a little bit about cognitive behavior therapy in that. So hopefully you won't be too bored, but because it's part of coping, obviously, as well. But yeah, puberty is tough. Puberty is really tough. And so what we'll talk about in 2 weeks, a little teaser here for you, is how to handle hormones, how to handle, you know, somebody getting bigger, how to handle those social peer pressures that come when you're a teenager. And the only other thing I would say is every teenager is different, you know. So if I said, oh, for your son, you should do X, Y, and Z, I don't know your son from Adam. You know, you really need to make sure that you tailor your supports and your services contingent upon what a particular child needs. I will say this, though, that as a general rule, and I do a lot of individual therapy, as a general rule, though, it's more effective if it's a peer-to-peer interactions that you're trying to teach, to do it with peers, you know, whether it's a social skill group or whether it's somebody coaching on the recess for littler ones, stuff like that, that at the playground, somebody's coaching you, okay, go over and say hi to Susie or whatever. That in vivo interactions with other peers is really cool. The other thing I would say too, it's a really neat idea. It's not specific to teenagers, but there's a really cool company called Florio, Florio. Go online and check it out. And what they do is they take virtual reality sets, right? Like the game sets, but they've created programs for everything from real basic social interactions like making eye contact to I'm on their mailing list. So I saw one recently where it's teenager social interactions. So the kid on the spectrum on a virtual reality game basically is practicing social situations in a non-threatening way because it's all virtual reality rather than being with actual kids, you know, which can be sort of more, you know, difficult and stressful for kids. So as a practice role-playing scenario, check out Florio. They do a really, really nice job. What other questions or comments do people have? Did anybody, while they were watching this, go, that's me? Right? You probably did. Because like I said, every time I do it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's one I got to work on. You know, it's human nature. human nature to get caught in these distorted thought patterns, and just we're all works in progress. So being able to look at your own thought patterns, like as a parent to say, my kid's acting up in the mall, and somebody says, you know what that kid needs is a good smack, or what's, thank you so much, stranger giving parenting advice. And you get all upset, and that person's ignorant, they're obnoxious, and they are ignorant in the classic sense of the world. They have no clue what it is to have autism and to be a parent of a kid with autism. And so I've had parents, I work with parents that make like little business card size cards that basically just say, my kid has autism, I'm doing the best I can. If you want more information, go to autismspeaks.com. Or whatever. And then you're dealing with the kid in the restaurant, and something, what your kid needs, here's your card, just keep dealing with the kid. And it allows you to feel like you're more in control rather than feeling like you're ready to punch this kid because you're already, or this stranger, because you're already sort of worked up about your child acting up. So monitoring your own thought processes as a parent, whether it's parent of an autistic kid with autism, or typical kid. Like I said, my kids are 29 and 32, and I still have to monitor my thought processes with them, so I don't hover, and I don't give them advice they don't want to hear, things like that. Speaking of which, check out that I don't like fish conversations with my mom, because I'm still working on that one, obviously. So what other comments, etc., that you guys have at this point?
Well, if you guys think of anything that comes up as well, especially if you're in attendance for next week's session, feel free to email us here at the office and let us know any questions, and then we can relay that to Dr. Bruey to get the answers for you. Because I know it's a lot of information to process as well. So. It
is. I've actually even done full day workshops on teaching kids with CBT. When are you going to write a book? Somebody said, Kathleen. I haven't written books on CBT, and I'm glad you're saying that, because I've written books on like diagnosing kids with autism and stuff like that. But what you do want to do is go to Woodbine House, which is a publisher, and if you go to woodbinehouse.com, they have a whole series of paperback books, easy to read, not a whole lot of jargon, and that's specific to autism. It's called the Topics in Autism series within Woodbine House. And I would put money on, they have probably a book on there on CBT. They have ones on there on how to deal with kids that have anxiety, the kids on the spectrum. They have booklets on how to teach kids social skills.
What is the name of the publisher again?
Yep, Woodbine House, WOODBINE House, Woodbine House.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, go for it. They've got wonderful, wonderful books. And again, they're all easy reads, maybe, 70 pages max. And
Hello,
cheap.
I have a quick
$16.
question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Okay, so what are some key strategies, or overall have you found CBT to be successful, specifically amongst nonverbal kiddos?
Yeah, it's hard. CBT, frankly, requires a bit more of a sophisticated ability to think abstractly, which is tough with a kid that's nonverbal, because maybe they can, maybe they can't, but it's hard to test whether they can or not. And that's where, the ABA and CBT in conjunction, that's where you really put more weight on the ABA part of it, frankly, and incorporate some of the CBT through visual supports or whatever, and slowly, hopefully, get to the point where you can incorporate more of the CBT. But it is, practically speaking, it's going to be more applicable to kids that are verbal and able to, understand the whole abstractive. You can't see thoughts, so you have to sort of have an abstract perception to be able to understand the idea of changing thoughts. That said, I worked with kids that have IQs of 55, for some verbalizations though, that are able to say, I'll say, how do you change the way you feel? And they'll say, change think. And I'm like, that's right. So just teaching them some of those mantras can be helpful. And for kids that are nonverbal, again, you don't know all that's going on with them cognitively. So even if you have a video or audio tape of somebody else saying, or, it's okay, take a deep breath. It's okay, take a deep breath. Just you're saying there's thoughts and they hear it. even though they can't necessarily express it themselves. That can be helpful. There are some cool apps that you can download that are calming sort of apps. And if you research it, you know, there's one called Calm that I have on mine that I tried, except I didn't like it because it's, you get into it and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, for another, you know, $10 a month, whatever, they start
Yeah.
fleecing you a little bit. But there are other, if you go on and find Google apps for teaching nonverbal kids to relax, I bet you could find some as well.
I can definitely see, regardless from a parent's perspective, still like maintaining my thought process and him
Absolutely.
hearing those things too.
Mhm.
So thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And you can model it as well. So
Right.
even if you're working with a nonverbal kid, you can say, it's okay. The change is okay. You know, even if you're starting to get upset because a change is happening that you didn't expect, you know, so you're modeling that as well.
And I think even more of a focus on those physiological responses that you were talking about.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
Because it's, again, it's all interrelated. So you can have a child that's, you know, nonverbal, but if their body's relaxed, their mind is relaxed. You can't have a worked up mind if your body's, you know, all nice. And
Yeah.
relaxed. So the more you can teach the kid or help the kid stay relaxed as an antecedent strategy, the less you're going to have a worked up mind as well. It's a really good point.
Definitely. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. If you want to, I can send Lakin and she can pass to you guys. I have a really cool list of resources, whether local resources as well as online resources. It's just a one pager, but it's, you know, might be something that you might, not specific to CBT, just specific to autism.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. And when you send out the PowerPoints, I'll send, as soon as we're done, I'll send it to you and you can send it with the PowerPoints.
All right. Did anyone else have any questions? No. All right. So in the middle of all this, I did do a number generator to pick a winner for tonight. And tonight's winner is, and I hope I'm saying this right, Sierra Woofer. So yay.
Hey, Sierra. But it's a gift card.
It's a Starbucks gift card for this one. So the first 3 sessions are Starbucks, and then if you attend all, you can be put in for the Amazon one. So we'll email you for your information and everything and get that sent out to you as well.
That's what I give my staff. I've got, I meant to mention, it's not just me in Autism Solutions. I've got staff, other people that do diagnostic evals and therapy. And we also have, do you know what PCIT is? Parent-child interaction therapy? I have a PCIT therapist. It's really cool. Just briefly, it's not just for kids with autism. It's for any little one, age 3 to 7, that's showing some behavioral challenges. And you teach the parent strategies, and then you have the parent in a playroom at the clinic where we are, and the therapist watches the parent through a one-way mirror, and the parent has a Bluetooth in their ear, and the PCIT therapist is giving them in vivo, you know, live coaching of, okay, now say this, now don't forget to do that, now do that. It's a really, really cool setup. So, and the reason I bring up my staff is because I always get them Starbucks gift cards. Christmas, end of the year, they know it. They love, I used to try to every time think, oh, what could I get them? And they all love the Starbucks gift card. So I just stuck with them.
Coffee's always a winner.
Absolutely.
They did not come just for the gift card, though, Dr. Bruey. You have great information. So
Oh, no, it's always fun. And as I said, when I've done these before with that group, for whatever reason, I've worked with some parents that are just, frankly, you know, not quite as fun to present to. I'll be diplomatic. And I really, even though it was Zoom, I really enjoyed it. So hopefully you'll be here next week and then the week after that.
All right. I'm going to end the recording.